Thank you for joining us for another episode of Baker Host's Ad Nauseam, a podcast series focusing on new and trending advertising issues with an emphasis on the FTC and the NAD. I'm Randall Rubenking, and you're listening to Baker Hosts. We are once again joined by Amy Mudge and Daniel Kaufman, two partners from Baker Hostetler's advertising, marketing, and digital media team. Together, they have decades of advertising experience and approach advertising issues from multiple perspectives. On today's episode of Ad Nauseam, Amy and Daniel talk about what to expect with the transition back to a Trump FTC in January 2025. With that, welcome to Ad Nauseam, and let's turn it over to Amy and Daniel.
Welcome back, everyone, to Ad Nauseam. Daniel and I did some work travel recently. We're just back from the yearly Association of National Advertisers Law Conference. This year it was in beautiful Scottsdale, Arizona. And while we were there, Daniel and I did a panel. It was super fun. It was a fake live-esque version of Ad Nauseam, featuring two very special guests, the FTC's Serena Viswanathan, who's in charge of ad practices, and the NAD director, Laura Brett.
It was a really great conference and really great to have the opportunity to talk to both of them and to have everyone there hear from them in front of what would be our largest Ad Nauseam audience, maybe about 600 people there. So Serena and Laura both have real busy jobs, of course, and we really appreciate their willingness to share some key insights about both the FTC and NAD.
Daniel, it was like 6,000, 60,000. There were so many people. The ANA is the advertising prom. All right. That is definitely our biggest show. And, hashtag goals for 2025 that we increase our listening audience on our podcast, right? To that many. But it was, this is obviously a really interesting time to talk to them. The election happened the week before, and we're still digesting it all, but obviously it's something that's top of mind for everyone, including the advertising law community, about what is this transition going to mean. And people seem to be really interested in our views about this. So, and I think, Daniel, your experience there is so unique. We thought that it would be good for our regular listening Ad Nauseam audience to hear the benefits of some of your wisdom, because you personally have been through like a gazillion transitions at the FTC, so really have lived experience.
Yeah, Amy, back in the Stone Age when I was at the FTC, living through those transitions. I'm not quite that old, but look, it struck me really at ANA, sitting in a lot of panels, and so much of the discussion, you immediately started thinking, well, is this going to be the right answer in 2025? And are things going to shift in 2025? But look, I'm happy to share what I know and how the handover actually happens. And of course, some of this is going to be us looking into our crystal balls. But speaking of, before we dive in, Amy, what predictions have you made in your life that ended up being horribly wrong?
Oh, in my life, like my whole life?
Okay. We care about the trivial things also.
That is true, Daniel. We are nothing if not deeply superficial and trivial. But all right, I'll do two. Okay, I'll do one sort of more recent and one longer term. So when skinny jeans went away last year, I was convinced. A couple of years ago, I was like, they're dead. I threw all my skinny jeans away. Now all I have are like very wide legs, mom jeans, and skinny jeans are coming back. So I got to do a lot of shopping. I think longer term, and this is one that still haunts me. When Blackberries first came out, I was part of the Blackberry test pilot group at my law firm. And I remember thinking, this is the key to having a life outside the office. We can leave now. That prediction was horribly wrong. I did not at all see these smart devices coming, the ball and chain that frankly they are. What about you?
So actually also like two technology thoughts, because, change happens and you don't expect it. So I hung on to my AOL account and my AOL email address for longer than any other human being, until people were sort of mocking me for sort of sticking to my AOL email address. So that was something that I just thought was going to last longer. And the iPod. I mean, I invested a lot of money into sort of music systems that I can use my iPod for. And of course, that all eventually disappeared. But look, the changes have been wonderful and amazing, but like hard to predict in a lot of senses.
I still have a red Nano. Okay, it's the red, like the Bono one. So when we bought it, like, some money went to charity, and it has the greatest 80s playlist on it that was ever created. There's a dance mix and there's a dinner mix, and we can't get it off of there. It is just, I still have it, and I look at it and it makes me sad.
Is that the version that had the forced YouTube album that people still complain of to this very day?
I don't know that. All I know is it mocks me with the greatest 80s playlist ever that I can't, I can't get out. So Daniel, a little bit more on predictions. Have you ever had your fortune told or tarot cards read or anything? And do you have if not, or even if so, do you have a favorite celebrity medium?
Well, I mean, obviously, Miss Cleo will always be my favorite celebrity
You
medium.
put her
No,
in jail, didn't you?
well, the FTC went after her eventually, yeah, but no, those commercials were just everywhere. But no, I've never done that. Have you?
I've always aspired to, but actually it scares me a little when I walk by them. I'm like, I don't know if I want to. I don't know what will they tell me. I don't know if I want to hear that. So no, I actually haven't either. If any of our listeners are mediums and engage in fortune telling and want to reach out and offer Daniel and I a gratis thing, I think we should do it. D. I think
I would
2025 is the year.
absolutely.
Okay, so let me get before we get to our navel gazing, which we indeed will, and I'm a little nervous about that too, in case as you teased up, Daniel, maybe we're going to be completely wrong about all of it, because this is really a anything goes kind of time. But there are actually certain procedural things that happen that are pretty much guaranteed after a presidential election at the FTC, right between now and January and then after January. So, can you kind of walk us through those steps?
Yeah, I mean, look, traditionally transitions weren't a big deal at the FTC. Changes happened, but it wasn't sort of dramatic. Things are different these days, and generally what we're going to see. So between now and the inauguration, current leadership, staff, they're going to be doing some triage there. They will be sort of probably moving forward a little bit more quickly on some matters that they want to get out the door since they have a majority. And they'll be probably closing down some matters that they don't think would survive into the next administration. I think because of disparate opinions, there's going to be a little more of a focus on like, is there stuff we want to get done, stuff we sort of want to surrender on? So that will certainly start to happen. That said, Congress is, of course, watching what the FTC is doing and has sent letters to the FTC raising concerns about partisan activity during this post-election period. So that's what we'll see happen between now and January 20th. And at that point in time, one of the two Republican commissioners, Holyoke and Ferguson, one of them will be elevated to either chair or acting chair. So they will take over the agency. However, at that point in time, there's not a huge amount they can do in terms of bringing new cases or shutting down law enforcement that exists. I mean, there are three Democrats there, and even if Lena Khan leaves at inauguration, it's going to be a 2-2, and you have a stalemate. So until there is a sort of third Republican commissioner who is nominated and confirmed by the Senate, there are limits to what the new leadership come January 21st will be able to do at the FTC. There's a lot they can do, to be clear, but they can't, for example, like start a new rulemaking or stop a rulemaking that's in progress. There definitely are limits to what they can do.
So it sounds like there's a little bit of stop and start stuff now, like a little few speed bumps now, and then it sounds like there'll be a few more speed bumps in January. But look, isn't it Chair Khan's term is already up, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about how the appointments are made, how they're staggered?
Yeah, and this is different than other agencies. My understanding is a lot of other agencies, if you're a commissioner and your term expires, you're done. You don't get nominated and reconfirmed. The FTC is different. You can be holdovers, and people have been holdovers for actually many years. So Chair Khan's term expired, I think it was September of this year. She can stay on as a commissioner until her replacement is confirmed and nominated. And there are five commissioners. They've got staggered terms, so it's not like they all come due in the same year. It's staggered by year, and different commissioners expire at different points in time for different seats. So her replacement will be sort of nominated and confirmed by the Senate, and the question is how quickly does the Senate act on things like that? And, the FTC is certainly a lot more high profile than it was in previous transitions. So I do think there'll be a quicker push to get a third Republican commissioner into the FTC. I know you remember this, Amy. Under the first Trump administration, I think it was a year and a half.
It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
It took them forever, and and I never understood why it took them that long. Although Chair Commissioner and then Chair Maureen Olhausen was there. She knew what she was doing. She's very smart on both sides of the competition and consumer protection. So maybe the thought was I'm going to focus on other agencies because the FTC's doing just fine. But yeah, I mean, she was there a good long time. I mean, I'd have to think there'd be a lot of tension between a Democrat who says, I probably should stay to make sure that my voice is still heard here and I can have an effect on stuff versus the natural impulse to sort of peace out and go back to your regular life, whether it's, Chair Khan's going to return to teaching or what's going to be kind of next for her. But I remember when Acting Chair Olhausen was in, I think it got down to 2 commissioners. I think there was Terrell McSweeney and Commissioner Olhausen and Chair Olhausen were there. So there was 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. And that was absolutely fascinating. A little bit about how does the commission actually operate with fewer than 5? Is there a minimum number they need?
So I think research was done, and I think there are arguments that 1 commissioner can still keep the place running. I'm sure that would be challenged. We didn't quite get there. We had 2 commissioners for a while, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat. And look, I mean, they had to work together to get stuff done. They were automatically at stalemates on everything if they wanted to be. So it actually really required the 2 of them to engage as they can under the sunshine laws, which govern the FTC, but they had to work through things and compromise. And theoretically, if you've got a stalemate, that's not good for an agency in terms of getting law enforcement out the door and getting things done. So it really required the 2 of them to sort of get together, get work done, compromise. And they did that both well. I mean, there was a pretty good track record of cases being voted out when there were 2 commissioners at the agency. And I sort of give both of them kudos for that, because not everyone would be able to accomplish that.
I mean, for a lot of years, this agency was not all that political, which is probably why it was fairly, I don't want to say easy, but maybe less traumatic to go through leadership changes. Certainly, there are going to be tweaks at the margin, but generally, competition law and consumer protection law are things that tend to be a little bit less partisan. But I think we sort of expect all that stuff to change. But Daniel, something that you've talked to me about, and I've been really fascinated, and I'd love to have you talk to our audience about, is the Congressional Review Act. Obviously, this FTC, the Khan FTC, is engaged in a flurry of rulemaking, and including we've had a couple of rules very recently put into final status. What can Congress do to take a look at those rules?
So there is a lot they can do, and especially now that the Republicans have taken over both the Senate and the House, or will be taking it over, there's a lot they can do. So the Congressional Review Act, pretty complicated in terms of what rules can be subject to it, but they can invalidate rules that were promulgated sort of a certain number of days before the new administration starts. And we saw that with the previous Trump administration. There were roughly, I think it was 15, 16, or 17 rules that agencies issued that were invalidated by the incoming administration. And that certainly is something that may happen to 1 or 2 of the FTC rules that we've been talking about, or we'll be talking about. The negative option rule, for example, could be, I think, a candidate for that. But it was quite a significant number that were undone in the first Trump administration. And I don't think there's a reason to think that they won't do that again. The question becomes, are some of the FTC rules going to be in that pool that's being considered for that?
But the act does relate to rulemaking. I take it doesn't relate to undoing or re-examining enforcement that had been finalized. Or what about guidance? Guidance is in that gray area of rulemaking. Is it a rule? Is it just guidance?
I think it might also cover policy statements. I'm not 100% sure, but it definitely covers rules, and it doesn't cover law enforcement.
Well, they got a lot to do with rules if they're going to enforce this, or if they're going to use this power, because goodness knows this has been the rulemakingest FTC that I've ever seen. But let's Talk to us a little bit about what doesn't change. We certainly, in all of our pending investigations, our clients have been very interested in what does this mean? Will our case get closed? How can we move things forward? And the as Daniel, as the staff remains in place, and they've got jobs. They've got to keep things moving. So I think my expectations is that the FTC investigations will continue. As you said, there might be a little bit of a slowdown while there's some internal considerations, but it's generally business as usual amongst the staff. If you have an ongoing investigation, conventional wisdom might say now's a good time to check in with staff, see what they're thinking. Maybe there are ways to narrow the case, but Daniel, what are your thoughts on that? And what are some things people should not do? Okay, because I know you've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, look, it is a difficult time for FTC staff. You're right; they stay, and most of the management stays throughout the agency. The bureau directors will most likely get replaced, but staff stays, and they're still working on your investigations. And there are many investigations they're working on that have bipartisan appeal. So it may be sort of resolved a little differently under Republican administration versus Democrat, but there certainly are some cases that are being investigated that would be disfavored by the administration in 2025. So, look, to me, the things not to do is to assume that your case is going to go away, or to sort of, when I was at the FTC in 2016 after the election, we had an outside counsel meeting, and they sort of started the meeting by proclaiming, hey, the Election Act happened, this case should go away. That did not go over well. Case did not go away. And it was a matter that, I think had some bipartisan support. So it's sort of interesting. It's fine to engage with staff, but there's a lot that's happening at the agency that none of us are privy to right now, sort of figuring out what cases they really want to focus on, what cases might they let go of. We know, like in the AI area, we know there were some significant disputes between the commissions on at least one of the AI cases that was issued about a month ago. And certainly if they're doing AI cases that are consistent with where the dissent landed or raising those concerns, I think they should be taking a closer look at some of those investigations and wondering, is this worth spending resources on? So hopefully they are realistically looking at, look, some of these we know are just not going to go forward in the next administration. Let's focus on some other things instead, perhaps.
Okay. Well, all right, let's move on to predictions. So I'm going to make one that's not, that might not be particularly controversial, but I think, and one that practitioners can probably all agree on, that we will see less rulemaking in the new FTC. Making rules, it seemed like kind of like a personal crusade of Chair Khan, and she did a lot to streamline the processes. But even so, making rules they're real slogs. Do you agree with this? And talk to us a little bit more about what, if any, rules you think are going to have that a fresh look. I know you said negative option was probably one.
Yeah, no question. The rulemaking binge is going to come to an end. Now, of course, any rules the FTC already is responsible for, they will continue to enforce. They will continue to consider them and update them on a 10-year schedule. So, for example, the Textile and Wool Labeling Act, it is not going anywhere, certainly not soon.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness. Protect me to make sure I get real cashmere. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, they're far less likely to continue writing new rules or to continue proceeding with the rules like the privacy commercial surveillance rule that didn't come to fruition. So any rule that we've seen in the last few years that was voted out by a 3-2 decision with a Republican dissent is in a precarious position. Now, we're going to talk more about the negative option rule. That's particularly vulnerable because I think it is in that window where Congress can also get involved in undoing it. But there's the non-compete rule. That is still technically alive. It's been stayed by a court. And, I think it's unlikely to survive the next administration, but we'll see what happens. But another consumer protection / privacy one that we haven't really talked about much is the health breach notification rule. And this was an amendment to the rule that was put out about a year and a half ago. And it really broadened the scope of what was covered by the rule. And it was a 3-2 decision. And I do think it wouldn't be surprising if the incoming commission takes a close look at that and considers maybe reopening the rulemaking or something of that nature for rules like that.
Okay. Let's well, I think one we would probably agree we think is going to stand the test of time is probably the review rule that we talked about on a recent past
Yeah.
episode. That and but I think your point about watch the 3 2s is a really good one. And because that rule was a 5-0. I think I'm going to get the name wrong. Was it the government imposter rule?
Close enough. Close enough. I think that's it.
It was that don't act like you're a .gov if you're not. I mean that one probably not so controversial. Probably we'll see.
Right. But remembering in that rule, so they finalized that rule, but then they also continued the rulemaking to see whether parties should be liable for aiding and abetting people who are engaged in government impersonation. And I think that extended rulemaking will likely stop. So even when they sort of put out sort of a rule that was relatively non-controversial, sort of they did try to push it further, and we're evaluating that. So I think that part of it will come to a halt.
So do you think what about the rules that are in some state of process, like the junk fee rule? Do you think any of those will continue, or do you think they'll just close up shop?
Look, I think it's going to be very rule specific. I think there is bipartisan interest in some sort of junk fees rule. Obviously, it was a big hallmark of the Biden administration, but I do think there is bipartisan support. So, look, some of these areas, I think they could navigate sort of a compromise position, perhaps, and come up with a rule that everyone could agree to. But I think junk fees is going to be harder for them to sort of end because there's just so much interest in it. But
Okay.
some of the rulemakings will go away.
All right, so I am sick to death of talking about rules. I know the FTC staff is sick to death about talking about rules. Let's move on to more of our bread and butter, Daniel. What are your thoughts on how, if at all, enforcement actions are going to change?
So, well, let's start with what's not going to change. There will still be robust enforcement of the law by the FTC. There was lots and lots of enforcement under Chairman Joe Simons with lots of real precedent setting settlements.
Yeah, I used to joke that those were Republicans that were not acting like any Republicans I had seen before. But I mean, Joe Simons had been around DC for a very long time, and goodness knows if we are going to have an outsider that's appointed this time. But certainly, it was a very aggressive FTC during the first Trump presidency.
Yeah, and let's be clear, like anything can happen. We don't know, have no idea who's going to take over his chair, and they may have a completely different mindset than we're thinking. But look, we will likely see a return to more of the traditional fraud enforcement that has been less of a focus of the Biden FTC. They've done fraud work, but not nearly as much as other administrations. But tech is going to remain in the spotlight, and issues such as how social media sites moderate content and deplatform users. These are issues that Commissioner Holyoke has already flagged are of interest to her.
All right, and I know you mentioned this. I do think that AI is certainly going to be something that the FTC looks at. I think they want to claim some territory for it, right? I think there's a lot of looking about who should have oversight for AI, and I think the FTC has made some pretty good arguments as to why they're a good agency to have a stake in that. And to connect it back to fraud, the recent sweep of AI cases included a couple that were really there were cases about use of AI and over promising what AI can do, what AI services can do to help small business owners earn more money. And that seems like something the FTC would continue. That to me sounds like garden variety fraud, even with an AI overlay.
Totally agree. And focusing on vulnerable audiences, small businesses, the elderly, kids, teens, vets, certainly we'll see that in consumer protection cases.
Now, there have been some pretty scary rumblings out there that maybe we won't even have an FTC, that its mission could pretty easily get moved to other agencies. DOJ could handle competition, financial practices could go to the CFPB, FDA could pick up advertising for products that it regulates. I mean, I frankly can't imagine a world without an FTC, but, what do you think?
I mean, those alarm bells do go off at the agency, every few years. And there's sort of, why do we have two competition authorities? And look, nothing is outside of the realm of possibility. But assuming the FTC still stands, which is certainly more likely than not, to put it mildly, it's important to remember that largely consumer protection has not really been a politicized issue. And it is something that Republicans and Democrats have promised to defend against fraud, deception, and invasions of privacy. Privacy is very much a bipartisan issue.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chair Khan did not exactly endear herself to conservative lawmakers. And, probably the FTC might have been more front and center in Congress than typically it is. And there was rumblings about budget cuts. Do you expect to see that? And what would that mean?
Yeah, I mean, the rumblings were pretty loud by the House of Representatives in the past year or so to really significantly cut the FTC's budget. I mean, now with the change in administration, probably less likely, but the agency's tackled budget issues in the past and will continue to sort of reallocate resources appropriately. But I do think, given the change in administration and the fact that they've got the presidency, the House, and the Senate, I think there will be less interest in striking the FTC's budget, certainly.
And we did talk about the staff usually stays in place. There was some fair amount of staff movement, including by you, in fact, the last change of administration. Do you think that staff is gonna stay put? Do you think we're gonna see another kind of mass exodus?
I mean, look, there are probably people that came to the FTC in the past 3 or 4 years specifically wanting to work for Chair Khan's agenda. So, I think if this sort of relatively small number of staff were there with that mindset, probably more likely to go. But generally speaking, staff is going to stay there. And look, FTC staff do a really good job of executing the mission of the chair and the commission. And that's their job, to sort of execute the chair and the commissioner's mission. And they'll continue to do that in a way that hopefully is thoughtful, is efficient, is consistent with the mission. So I do think you're not going to see dramatic turnover at the staff level, barring some sort of chair who is sort of unexpected and comes from out of the blue and perhaps does things that are just untenable. But hopefully that's not going to happen.
Well, with that, we've come to the end of another episode of Ad Nauseam with Daniel and I looking into our crystal balls. And it will be very interesting. Maybe a year from now, Daniel, we'll do another episode to see how right or how wrong we were. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Come back again for Ad Nauseam.
Thank you, Amy and Daniel. If you have any questions for Amy or Daniel, their contact information is in the show notes. For more information on the latest developments in ad law, visit our Adventures in Law blog at www.adventures-in-law.com and check out all Ad Nauseam episodes by subscribing to Baker Hosts wherever you get your podcasts. As always, thanks for listening to Baker Hosts. Comments heard on Baker Hosts are for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. Listeners should not act upon the information provided on Baker Hosts without first consulting with a lawyer directly. The opinions expressed on Baker Hosts are those of participants appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information about our practices and experience, please visit bakerlaw.com.